I'd like to start off today by saying Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers, including my wife. Today's going to be the perfect message for Mother's Day. It will talk about a word that they're very familiar with, no. In fact, the title of the sermon today is The God of No. And we're going through this series because we have some ideas of who God is, and oftentimes one of the things that people say about God, about Christianity in general, is that it's a religion of no. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. Don't touch the things that are bad for you, and just no, 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 no. And we get this idea of God as being a God of no. And we're going to talk about why that is completely true, and hopefully give you a better understanding of what that actually means. Not the way that we understand it, but the way that Scripture actually talks about it. So Pete gave me a bunch of books when I started in the English service, and I was so motivated to read at that point that I went on Amazon and I started looking for interesting books on just various topics. And one of the things I was interested in is how-to books. I had found a book that was talked about and well received. It had been published hundreds of thousands of times. It was how to win friends and influence people. So it was one of the best sellers. When I searched for how-to books, it was right near the top. And as it was expected, this book sold countless copies. Not as much as the Bible, but it's getting up there. And that was expected, but the list was intriguing. I was curious, what's further down this list of books? So the next one that I saw that kind of caught my eye was How To for Dummies, How to Fix Everything for Dummies. It's a little bit insulting, but I get where they're going. You know, not all of us can claim to be geniuses. So I understood where it was coming from. But this list was getting more and more interesting as we were going down. And the next one that I found was particularly surprising, Crafting with Cat Hair. Now, in and of itself, this book is funny that it came up so high on the list. I think it was like on page 1 or 2. The most interesting thing is that you can see it says #1 bestseller in felting. So in other words, out of all the books that relate to felting, this was literally at the top, Crafting with Cat Hair. Now, I don't know how many of you have cats, how many of them shed, but if you're interested, this book exists for you. If you want to figure out what to do with all of that cat hair, that is the book for you. Now, I couldn't stop there. As you know, the little rabbit holes that I go down, I could not stop there. I had to click through and through and through, and we finally got to How to Talk to Your Cat about gun safety and abstinence, drugs, Satanism, and other dangers that threaten their 9 lives. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, maybe we've gone a little bit too deep. I mean, there is literally a how-to book for, I think, any subject that you'd want, especially on Amazon. You can search anything that you want. And if it's lacking on Amazon, you can always go to Google and you can say how to. So how to make slime, so a kid's project. How to tie a tie. How to block a number on Android. How to be a Latin lover. These were my suggestions. I tried it on several different browsers. The last one came up each time. I don't know why. Your results might vary. So the world has plenty of answers of how to. You can read a book, you can do a search, you can answer the how-to. The question is, should you? Should you collect your cat hair and make felt projects out of it? And the answer is probably not in a lot of cases. That's probably not an activity that you want to spend your time on. So the world, it does this fantastic job. It says, how do I? How do I do good things? How do I do not so good things? But we really don't have a category that says, should I? And Scripture comes in and it fills this gap of not just the how-to, because there's a lot of how-to in it. It also fills in this gap of should I? In your impressions of God, they might be that, okay, the Bible's all about do, don't. It's a how-to. But the wisdom in Scripture, the wisdom of God as a God who says no, is that it allows you to align what you want to do, what you can do, with what you should do. And wisdom is the state. I want you to kind of think about the statement. Wisdom is a state of harmony with God and reality. In other words, you see the world for how it is, and it syncs with God and what He wants from you. Because ultimately, God's suggestions, God's recommendations, God's commands, they are there for your benefit. And when you delve into God's wisdom, what you get out of it is you get this how-to book, this should-you book, and it allows you to both avoid heartache, but also to find happiness in what He suggests. Now, where do people get this idea of God being the God of no? Well, you don't have to look very far. In the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis, we already have this, the first inklings that God is not all about, do whatever you want. This is perfect. And as we start reading the first book, what it starts off with is God creating light and dark. God creating water and God creating land. God creating the plants and God creating the animals. And finally, God culminating in the creation of man. And so far, God has not spoken to man. That is recorded here. And in Genesis 2, verses 16, we get the first words, the very first words that are recorded in Scripture of God speaking to man and we have the exact words. Because God spoke to Adam before, but these are the exact words that God spoke. And we're reading Genesis 2, 16 and 17. The Lord commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat, you will surely die." Now, if you do the count, we've got 31 verses there and we've got 16 there. So 48 and a half verses into the first book of the Bible, the very first words that are spoken by God that are recorded, we get a command that says, no. You can eat everything, but don't eat this fruit. And we get this idea, okay, this is what God's about. The first words that are spoken are, don't. Don't do this. And we think about it and we think, okay, God's given this command. And we think to our own lives and we think, okay, how difficult would it be for me to obey this command? Right now, we have hundreds of rules, hundreds of laws. Even in society, we have hundreds of thousands of laws. So many laws that dictate everything from what's considered cabbage to what's considered sleepwear. There was a whole trade dispute that hinged on the fact, is a Snuggie a blanket or is it a clothing item? Because depending on which it is, it will be taxed at a different rate. So we've gotten down to the minutia of, is a Snuggie a blanket or is it a clothing item? And we think, okay, we start off with just one rule. We start off with one very simple thing. And humanity can't even get it right. So what happens next? Well, we start off with one rule, and then things get worse. So as we read in the first set of laws that God gives to people is recorded in Exodus 20. And it starts with this, then God spoke all these words, saying. So this is the beginning of the 10 commandments. Now without cheating, how many of the commandments are prohibitions? 10 out of 10. They're all prohibitions. Come on. Anybody awake? No? Okay, so 10 out of 10? Anybody, please, somebody. Raise your hand. Are they 10 out of 10? No. Are they 9 out of 10 prohibitions? 9 out of 10. 8 out of 10. 5 out of 10? 5 out of 10? 1 out of 10? No, none of the commandments or prohibitions are just like, do whatever you want. Let's read and see what it says. And there's actually 2 right answers. It's either 8 or 9, depending on how liberal you are. So it says, and then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then the you shalls start. You shall have no other gods before me. And I'm going to skip parts that don't have the shall nots. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So this one's the one that's kind of up in the air. It doesn't have a shall not, but it's technically a prohibition. Don't do any work on the Sabbath. Here we go. Honor your father and your mother. The first commandment that isn't like directly don't do something. It says do something. Then you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. So basically either 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 of the commandments are direct prohibitions. So I don't blame you if you have this idea that God is a God of no. And he's just a God of no. And there's no other asterisk by it. There's no other explanation by it. He's just a God of no. He just says no, 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 no. Don't do all of these things. And this list, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we're in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, God was, I think everybody would agree, a little bit more strict because he was relying on this law. He was relying on people obeying this law. But then we get to the New Testament and we think, okay, God's going to lighten up. He's going to give us something a little bit more relaxed and he'll be a little bit more merciful, right? And then we open up Matthew 5:21. And the text in my Bible is red, so this is Jesus literally saying it. In other places, the text is black, which means that it's recorded, but it's not the actual word. So here, these are the actual words that Jesus said. You have heard the ancients were told. Now, I want to stop right here because this is super important. You have heard. This is basically the point of this series. You have heard something about God. You have heard that God in the Old Testament is different from the God in the New Testament. You have heard that God is a God of no. You have heard, and you build up this idea of who God is. And then you get to reading, and as we've kind of learned through this series, the God that we've heard of, the God that's been told to us by our neighbors, God, I think, is this person, that's why I don't go to church. Or God is evil and that's why I don't go to church. Or God isn't out for my benefit, he's out for, the fulfillment of his commands. And that's why I don't follow Christianity. And we've all heard something. And today you're going to hear something, but I don't want you to just hear it. I don't want you to just listen to the words that I say and read the words that I read. I want this to be something that changes in you. This whole series is dedicated to changing the way that you think. And you can hear all of these different words. But unless those words have an effect, and unless you go back in and you say, not only did I hear, I read, and I believe, will you have a change in your life. So you have heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable in court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry and his brother with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now, this is like a ramping up. How many of you have murdered somebody? Nobody? Okay, that's good. I feel a little bit safer up here. How many of you in the 1990s grew up and you said, fool? I pity the fool? So what it's saying here is not necessarily that word, but you calling your brother, you calling somebody else, you're an idiot. You don't know nothing. You're stupid. Breaking down a person. And he says, if you do that, if you break down a person, you deserve hell. And all of a sudden the escalation goes from, okay, I never murdered anybody, to you really considering, okay, geez, have I really been, messing people up emotionally throughout my life? And the Pharisees are thinking the same thing. I mean, we didn't do the bad stuff, Jesus. We obeyed the law as it was written. We're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to do what God's told us. And Jesus said, you're not. Because the law isn't talking about specific actions, it's talking about a way that you live. And then he goes on and he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her in her heart, for her has already committed adultery with her in your heart. And I'm thinking, are you hearing this? Like adultery, you go to the dictionary and it says having intimate relations with somebody other than your spouse outside of the bonds of marriage. And here Jesus is saying, look, you don't even have to physically touch. You never have to see her. You never have to know her. You never have to be with him. You can commit adultery at 1,000 miles. This is long-distance sinning. You don't need to have a one-on-one relationship to sin. And these people's minds are blown. Because to them, God is a God of no, and there are very specific rules of things you can't do. And all of a sudden, Jesus is just like blowing up these rules with more and more details. All of a sudden, everybody who's in the crowd is guilty. And they're not ready to hear this. You know, when we were kids, for you guys, I'm sure the story is the same as well. There was always the sibling who was the bigger, smarter, I like to think, one, and then there was a shorter but faster and wilier one. And that was the case with my brother and I. And as was usually the case, if you're out ahead, you want to make sure to maximize that advantage. You want to make sure you do whatever is possible so that you can stay out at front. So we'd be playing basketball in the backyard. Now, I don't know if I was necessarily smarter, but I was definitely craftier, and I knew that my brother was 10 times faster than me. He could shoot from 10 times further away, but he was short enough that if I held the ball over my head, he couldn't reach it. And I knew that that was my pain point. So what we'd be doing is I would grab the ball and I would hold it over my head, and he's trying to jump to grab it, from my hand so that he can score. Now, he couldn't quite reach. Not only could he not reach, by the time he if he took a trip around me, by the time his car got around to the other side, he would be half a tank of gas lighter. So by the time he would go around, so I would hold the ball out, I would hold him down, and he'd be doing, this, and I'd hold him by the head, and he'd be trying to get the ball from me, and all of a sudden, as soon as he noticed that that was my tactic, new rules came into play. New rules came into play where you can't do that. So you can't hold me back. If you're going to dribble, then dribble. You can't just hold the ball and just slowly aim and shoot. That's not possible. So I'm like, okay, we'll think of something else. So instead of doing that, I would just come up to the basket as close as possible. I would hold it up over my head. Again, he can't grab it out of my hands. And I would just toss it in. Now, I suck at basketball. So I was 2 feet from the hoop, and I'd still miss those shots. So in the end, I felt like it was a fair game. He didn't feel that way. And obviously a new rule came into play, and I'm like, no, I'm not playing by your rules. I've got my set of rules of basketball. I know what the NBA says. This is totally legit, and I'm gonna keep doing it. Basketball games didn't last very long after we got to that point. But the Pharisees, they feel very much the same like my brother felt. They feel, okay, Jesus, look, we have this rule book that we're going by. And this rule book has very clear rules. Adultery means adultery. If God wanted us not to lust after women, he would have added, do not lust. We would have had 11 commandments. And Jesus comes in and he says, no. You don't understand the rules. You're playing by your own interpretation of the rules. That's not what happened. And Jesus came in and he changed these rules. And all of a sudden, not only is God the God of no, but he's the God of no to a degree that people really didn't even understand. I mean, how far did the rules stretch? I'm not necessarily lusting about a real person. Does that count? How deep can we go? Jesus, how deep does this rule book that you have go? And they felt cheated, and they're like, we're not going to listen to these rules. And Jesus comes through and he says, look, these rules, these are not my rules. These are the rules that God has established because they talk not just about the things that you do, but they talk about the heart. And the prohibitions that God made, these were rules that you would not be able to obey on a good day, much less the rules that he actually meant. And then we read in Matthew 5:21, he says, you have heard, and then in 27 he also says, you have heard, and he lists these verses. You have heard that you can't commit adultery. You have heard you can't lust. And these Pharisees are just blown away. They understand God is the God of no, but this is taking it to a level that they're not ready for. And the popular narrative became that God is the God of no. God is the God of prohibitions. And it's not about the rules. It's not about the rules, it's the point of the rules. And the point of the rules is to have wisdom. In Matthew 7:27, he's continuing this conversation, and he says this interesting things. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And he says, look, I get that you don't agree with these rules, but this is what you're going to be judged according to. And if you hear these words, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, if you hear these words and act on them, then you will be as though you were a wise man. How many of you here want to be wise? At least as far as God's eye is concerned. None of you want to be a fool. And being called a fool by somebody who is not God is one thing, but being called a fool by God is a completely different thing. None of us want to be a fool. If you're single and your parents are talking about, your successes, and they say, Johnny is the fastest fifth grader the school has ever had. He blows the other kids out of the water, and they're like, wow, your son's really gifted, right? He's bound for the Olympics. It's like, he's gifted. He's 23, so he does do a good job against the fifth graders. That's not the kind of rumors, that's not the kind of words you want spoken about you. If you're married, you want to be wise in that way as well. You don't want to be the husband that it's Mother's Day, you want to prepare something nice, the wife runs into the kitchen because there's a burning smell, and you're just making cereal and somehow it caught on fire. You don't want to be that person. You want to be wise. And here Jesus gives you the prescription for that wisdom. He gives you very clear instructions on how to be wise. He says, listen to these words and follow them. And as far as God is concerned, it doesn't matter about your knowledge of the rules. As far as he's concerned, he's not about the rules. The Pharisees knew the rules really well, and he chewed them out, and he said, look, that's not enough. That's not what we're talking about. And what Jesus says is act on them. And if you want to summarize this as just one sentence, he says, it's not about what you know, it's about how you live. It's not about what you know, it's about how you live. Guys, come on, video room. There we go. It's not about what you know, it's how you live. And that's the point that Jesus was saying. Look, you can be a straight A student. You can have PhDs on PhDs. You can have an alphabet soup of degrees after your name. You can be a dropout. What Jesus is concerned about is not what you know, but how you live. And what he was saying is, look, you know the rules. And you say you follow them. But you weasel your way around them. And God becomes this God of no, because he says no to one thing, and you're like, well, technically, you didn't say murder, but if I make a trap and the person just happens to walk by it and he dies, that's technically not murder. He was just a little bit clumsy. He stepped on that landmine that was outside of his front door. He should have been a little bit more cautious. He knows what kind of people don't like him. And he's saying, no, all these rules, I can make as many rules as I want. I can make them as detailed as I want, and you're going to weasel your way around it because you're not living the right way. And he calls them and he says, look, listen. Don't just know, listen to what I'm saying and do it. We went on a cross-country trip with my family at the beginning of this year, and we went to Florida. Now, we got there, and, that's the upper half of Florida. At the bottom half, you see Orlando, and at the top, you see Jacksonville. So those are the two airports that are of any respectable size. Our friends live directly in the middle of those two airports, right there. So it doesn't matter which one you choose. It's basically the exact same drive, either up or down. There technically is one more airport that's right next to them, but the only flights in or out are on a crop duster with 2 seats. So unless you're hitching the kids underneath, you're not going to make it there. So we arrive, and the first thing that I have to do, I'm in a completely different space. Florida looks completely different from California. So I have to hook up the GPS to figure out where we're going to be going. The first thing that you need to remember about Florida is bring a bunch of pocket change, because they have toll booths like every 15 miles. And if you're traveling for an hour and a half, they're going to drain you of all your change. So that's just a public service announcement. So we're traveling, and I plug in the address, and we're driving. Now, I can do one of two things. I can look at the map, and I can say, the GPS it's pretty good. But this path around here, it's one that I'm going to take because it looks like a shortcut. I can follow the GPS and it'll say, take this exit, and I can say, nah, the next exit looks better. But if I want to get to where I'm going, I'm going to follow the GPS. And if I'm in Florida and I don't know where I'm going, I'm going to be following the GPS. If it says turn right and there's a cliff, I will be following the GPS because it probably knows better than I do. There might be a ramp, I don't know, a roller coaster or something. So we're driving to their neighborhood, and the funny thing is, no matter how many times I've driven with GPS, the unit has never ridiculed me. Have your units ever called you incapable of understanding basic instructions when you take the wrong turn several times in a row? No, it doesn't do that. The GPS always says, recalculating. Sometimes you make the right turn and it still says recalculating, but that's a bug with the software. That's not the GPS unit. So no matter how many times you make the wrong turn, it'll always say recalculating. But there is a secret. After 5 times, it'll say, I'm sorry, you can't follow basic directions, and it'll shut off. And then you're on your own. And if you're in Florida and you're on your own, you're gonna end up in a gator field somewhere. Gator jerky is not just a term for gator jerky. It's a thing that tourists become if they wander in the wrong direction. But the GPS unit, it always directs you. It always says, this is where you are, this is where you're supposed to be, and this is how you get there. Now, if you're driving and you're trying to make a deadline, the GPS will also tell you about how long it'll take you to get there. So you know your meeting is in 20 minutes, the GPS says you're 15 minutes away. And you say, cool, I can do a detour. And you take that detour, but the thing is, the GPS isn't going to be able to tell you how long that detour is going to take. That GPS is going to say, okay, if you're going on the right path, you're going to arrive there 5 minutes early. But all of a sudden you take an exit that you can't make a U-turn on, that you can't get back on the freeway. And all of a sudden you have to drive 2 miles, do a 2-mile loop to get back on the freeway. And by the time you get back on, it says your estimated time of arrival is 20 minutes. And you realize that you're going to be late. Now, the GPS can't prevent you from being late. It can just tell you that, look, if you keep going on the route you're going to make it on time. If you decide to redirect, it can tell you how long it'll take you to get back. But it isn't going to be able to tell you how long it'll take you to get back before you make that wrong turn. And God's efforts, God's wisdom is very much like that GPS unit. And there are several reasons why we don't listen to God's advice. We think to ourselves, okay, I know a shortcut. God, I see this list of rules that you've given me, and this one, and this one are optional. Those turns that the GPS unit gave you, those are optional. I don't need to take them. That exit, I can skip it. That right turn, I can make a left. And we go through this list and we cut out God's rules and we say, look, these rules are not relevant to where I'm going. I looked at the map. I know where I'm going. I'm going to take a shortcut. And we take these shortcuts. We take these shortcuts through places that we want to go, maybe. They're the scenic route through the red light district. We might want to go there. We might want to see what it looks like. But the GPS unit can't tell you how long it'll take you to do that detour. It can just tell you how to get back. And what we tell God is we say, look, God, we see things more clearly from down here. This book that you've given us, this book, it was written by shepherds, it was written by slaves, it was written by people who lived in a time when GPS did not exist. I'm sorry, you don't know what you're talking about. And we take these detours. We set these landmines. We set these landmines for ourselves. We set them, we camouflage them, and then when we walk over them and blow off a leg, we're like, what happened? I thought you were looking out for us. And we don't realize that we didn't follow the directions that we were given. Sometimes we think that we can still make it on time. And I think a lot of people make the mistake where they say, I've got enough time. I know where I am. I know where I'm supposed to be, but I've got enough time to get there. I've got 20 years. I've got 20 years on this GPS. I've got 20 more years to figure out all these detours. I've got 20 more years to make it back to the road that I'm supposed to be on and to get where I'm going. And we spend 19 of those years detouring out. But we don't realize is that it might make 25 years to get us back. And we just run out of time. We've got a parable of this in the scripture where it talks about the wise and the foolish maidens who went out and they went to buy oil. And by the time they get back, they had missed their window of opportunity. And we do the same thing in our lives. We think we're just going to take this short detour. We're going to go see what's out there. And we look at our clock and we've got 20 more years before we have to be where we're supposed to be. And I think, we got time. I don't have to rush. And we don't realize that the ETA keeps growing the further we go out. And it'll take us longer and longer and longer to get back. But the last state that we can get into with God's GPS is we get to a point where we say, I don't care where I'm going. I don't care where I'm going to end up. And that seems silly if you're relying on a GPS signal that you're going somewhere. You want to go to a friend's house. You want to go to a resort. You want to go somewhere. You think, why am I then on the road if I don't care where I'm going? Everybody cares where they're going. We just don't realize how far the place that we're going to end up in is not a place we want to go. We think we don't care if we drive off a cliff. We don't care if where we end up is not where we were going. We just want to end up somewhere. We're not too concerned about where that is. And you'd never do that with a GPS system. You'd never put in wherever. There is no wherever button on your GPS. It needs a destination. And that's the scariest one. And then we get to the question, is God really the God of no? Is he really out there just to be a buzzkill? And the reality is no. God actually is not the God of no. And I did this calculation. I tried to find how many shalls and how many shall nots there were in the Bible. And there were 278 you shall nots. So those exact quotes, there's 278 you shall nots. And there were 865 you shalls. So we get this idea in our head that God is the God of no, but he's not. He is the God of yes. And he's the God that wants to direct us to a certain destination. He wants to make sure that we get there on time. He wants to make sure that we get there in one piece. And we've been conditioned to have this contradictory stance that if somebody says, look, you're wrong, don't go there, don't do this, no. We've conditioned ourselves. Just think about this. If somebody comes up to you and says, no, don't do that report that way, no, your project isn't finished, no, don't marry that person, we think to ourselves, this person does not like me. This person obviously does not see my creative vision. This person obviously doesn't see what I see in that person. This person hates me. They want my unhappiness. They want me to be sad. They want me to be depressed. They want me to not find satisfaction. Think about this. Society, if we say we are not for gay marriage, then that means you hate everybody who's not straight. If you say we're not for divorce, then what, do we hate everybody who's divorced? And we've been conditioned to this mentality of no means we hate you. And we do the same thing to God. We say God says no, that means he hates me. He doesn't want me to be happy. He wants to take away all of these things that mean happiness to me. And we say God is a God of no, and we use it as an insult. God says, I am the God of no. But he uses it as a compliment. I'm redirecting you away from these things. I want you to be happy. And Pete's wife, Anna, she talked about the reality of how she felt on missions. And I was thinking about this for this sermon, and I thought, this is what we need. We need real talk, and this is real talk for you guys. If I thought that porn was something that would give me ultimate happiness, I wouldn't be standing here today. If I thought that that was something that God was taking away from me, something good, something wholesome, something that would bring me eternal happiness, I wouldn't be standing here today before you. And the reality is, all the things that God tries to take away from your life, all the things that God tries to say no to your life, they are things that do not bring you happiness. They are things that break up your families. There are things that break up your marriages. There are things that break up relationships between siblings and parents. There are things that will drive you to an end that you don't want to end up at. And none of us want to be unhappy. And none of us want God to tell us no. But the reality is, we need no in our life just as much as we need yes. We need God to tell us no just as many times, if not more, than he tells us yes. Because he cares for us. He sent his son for us. He gave us salvation if we say that I will listen to the no's. And all of us, every single one of us, has things that God needs to tell us no for. And we need to accept that no, not as something that's done for our harm or for our unhappiness. Let God tell you no for your happiness. Let God be the God of no for you. That in the end, God will say, yes, come to me. Good and faithful servant. Humble and obedient son. Humble and obedient daughter. Yes, come to me. I will give you rest and I will give you joy unfathomable. Let us all stand and pray that God would tell us yes, tell us no for the things that need to be said no. Because ultimately, we are going to a destination, and I want all of us to end up there.